Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the Formula 1 race ratings for the 2023 Monaco Grand Prix. So as always, a big warm welcome to this race rating series, taking a look at how the drivers have performed during the race on Sunday. This week, round 6 in Monaco, as we return to the Principality for the latest round of Formula 1. Obviously last week in Imola was cancelled, so this picks up as round 6 where it would have been round 7 before. Before we get started also, just a quick reminder that if you do enjoy the video, to give it a thumbs up, check out some other content on the channel and get yourself subscribed to stay up to date with everything released this year. Now with that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting off with the result, and it is Max Verstappen who claims his 4th win of the season, his 2nd in a row, and the 6th win for Red Bull this year as they have won every single Grand Prix and a pretty commanding drive for him. In 2nd place, Fernando Alonso, who it's a good performance and a great result, but maybe he's a little disappointed as it's one of those races where he even said himself it's one he could win, but still 2nd is not too bad. 3rd place, a brilliant result for Esteban Ocon in the Alpine, the first sort of non-top 4 team and person and driver to score a podium. In behind him, both Mercedes of Hamilton and Russell, and then Charles Leclerc, the lead Ferrari. Not quite the best day for them regarding the strategy, we'll get onto that. In 7th, Pierre Gasly, the other Alpine, rounding off a great team performance, followed up by Carlos Sainz. Again, as I mentioned, not quite as good a finish as Ferrari may have hoped for. And then finally, rounding out the top 10 in 9th and 10th place, we have the McLaren pairing of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. Onto the race itself then, and I think for Monaco we can all pretty much agree it was pretty decent. Beginning on lap 1 at the front of the field, it stayed pretty calm. I don't think anyone swapped places. A bit further back though, there was a lot of drama going on. The first thing that comes to mind is Nico Hülkenberg diving up the inside of a couple of cars into Mirabeau, not quite getting it right, and he did get a penalty for it. Then at the hairpin, Stroll trying to squeeze through a gap between Albon and the barrier, causing him damage, and then people just generally stopping at the hairpin and getting caught in a bit of a traffic jam. But after the first lap, it did kind of settle down and sort of settled into that general Monaco type of race that we're used to seeing, but there were some interesting little battles going on and some people trying to make some moves. We had Sainz at the back of Ocon who went for it, didn't quite get it right. Then you had other people, you had that bunch of sort of Hamilton, Leclerc, who were all very close together. And I think in general, yes, it wasn't amazing, but for Monaco, it wasn't too bad. Then we got into pit stop territory where the medium runners were coming in. And interestingly enough, some medium runners came in early, some medium runners stayed out quite long. You look at the likes of Verstappen or maybe Lando Norris, who actually went all the way to the Inters. However, other people such as Hamilton and Ocon came in, potentially some swapping around there, but nobody really made any changes. We had Ferrari with Sainz swapping from the hard tyres onto the mediums, and I would have been really interested to see how that went had it not rained. But let's get to the part of the race that was the more chaotic bit, shall we say, which is of course where it started raining, and it started with a few little drops and a little bit of drizzle, but everyone generally carried on the dry tyres. And Fernando Alonso even came in to swap on with his normal strategy and came out on a fresh set of mediums rather than going for inters in a move that possibly may have cost him a shot at the win. I don't think you can say it definitely would have given him that P1, but it definitely took away any chance he did have of getting it. And then we saw other people. You look at the Ferrari drivers who took a while to swap over from the hard tyres onto the intermediates, and ultimately that cost them. They ended up finishing, down in 6th and 8th place when they were running up sort of around 4th and 5th for a lot of the time. You then had other drivers, as I mentioned, such as Verstappen, Russell was another one, who went straight onto the intermediate tyres, but even they made mistakes. We saw a lot of people going off at Mirabeau, a lot of people cutting the chicane. I think we had Sainz sliding off there, we had Russell sliding off, and then obviously came back on and collided with Perez. We had a number of other people making mistakes, and I feel like in this race, the cars were almost indestructible. They seem to bounce off of everything, hit things. Maybe it's just the slow speed of Monaco which is causing it. In the rain, no one's really travelling that fast and they do just kind of bounce off of barriers. But as the rain progressed, we saw a couple of people try some different things, such as Kevin Magnussen going with the hard tyres in the rain. An interesting choice, and I feel like one that Haas just generally went, let's just roll the dice with something. It may not be anything good, but it's something and that may get us somewhere. Unfortunately for them, it didn't, and Magnus ended up not finishing the race. And then you had at the back of the field as well someone like Perez, who was basically a guinea pig for Verstappen the entire time, trying out different tyres. But then into those last sort of 15-20 laps, it did kind of settle down and we had some people catching up to others, but generally staying pretty even throughout the field. Getting into some ratings then, and starting off with the poll I gave to you guys to fill in after every single race, and you've given it a 6.9. Nice. And you know what? For Monaco, I think that's roughly in the realms of fair. Obviously, Monaco, a lot of the races are typically a bit duller, there's not too much action going on, and I don't know if that potentially skews the rating that it kind of gets in the sense of, oh, it was all right, and because it's Monaco, that makes it seem better. Taking that into account, for my rating, I've gone slightly lower than that, and that's a 6.5. I do think it was still in that solidly good race. I 100% enjoyed watching it. And I think for Monaco, you know, if you take the list of Monaco races, it's probably maybe a 9 or a 10 even. However, looking at them as a whole, it's somewhere in that 6 to 7 range, which is where you guys have roughly given it, and I think that's pretty fair overall. Starting with drivers then, and we're going to begin with the Haas guys, and I feel like for Haas, and I'll take Kevin Magnussen as an example, I felt like their drivers were doing pretty well. However, they just ended up with a terrible strategy which mostly falls under the team. If we take Magnussen, for example, a lot of the time he was battling other cars. You know, you had Perez behind him and Stroll behind him, and generally was sort of keeping okay. However, as I said, where things unravelled were with the strategy moving onto the wet tyres, or in the case of Magnussen, not moving to the wet tyres, and that really just killed any sort of position that he had. Staying out on the hards meant that it was slow for him to get round. He even hit the barrier at Rascasse and then eventually retired later on. And that's not really his fault. But I would say for Magnussen, other than that, it felt fairly solid. And so I'm going to give him a 6.5. Then we move on to Nico Hülkenberg, who initially I thought had an amazing start. You know, he was up 4 places. But then we looked back and it turned out he had made some contact down into Mirabeau and throughout that opening lap, which meant he had to pit, and that relegated him pretty much all the way to the back, which in a place like Monaco is basically your race over. Even with a safety car, it means that you're at the back of the pack and it's virtually impossible to pass. So for Nico, I feel like it was a slightly disappointing race. Other than that first incident, I didn't really see too much of him. However, the rest of it seemed fairly quiet, which is all you can really hope for in Monaco, I guess. But for Nico, I think it's probably going to be a 3.5. Ultimately, you've made the contact early on, and that really does cost you here. So next up we have Williams, and I'm going to start with Logan Sargeant, someone who's had a bit of a disappointing start to the season, even as a rookie. However, in this one he started fairly well. He made up a couple of places early on the medium tyres, then swapped over to the hards, and sadly for him just 3 laps into that stint, got a puncture, which meant he had to swap onto soft tyres, which he took for 29 laps until the inters. So he was doing well and he was showing decent pace and position, however a puncture kind of stopped him in his tracks. What I will say though is he did manage those soft tyres very well, and I think it was mentioned that the team was sort of coaching him through that. And so I think for Logan, up until that point, he's had a fairly okay race considering the circumstances. When it was wet, we didn't really see too much of him besides getting a little bit stuck at the hairpin, though when you consider that even the likes of Verstappen were hitting the wall, Sainz was going off, Russell was going off, it was clearly very difficult conditions. So to only have a very small minor mistake, which didn't really cost him any damage or positioning, is not too bad. So I think for Logan, I'm going to give him a 5.5, it's round about that average grade, and for him it was a fairly solid race, and the puncture's not his fault at all. Actually, this is Taron from about 10 minutes later. I'm going to bump Sargeant's down to a 4, simply because I've just remembered all of the times early on in the race when he was passed by about 4 cars in the space of about 2 laps. And somewhere like Monaco, that's really not a good thing. Next up is Alex Albon, someone who we didn't really see too much of, but I felt that had a fairly okay race, and I think if we're not really seeing too much of him, then not too much can be going wrong, and that's kind of a good sign at somewhere like Monaco. Ultimately, he started 13th and finished 14th, and was one of the first people to pit from the medium tyres onto the hards, which you would have thought possibly could have helped him out, but overall I think everything was generally sort of neutralised, and people generally stayed in the same place. And when he came out, he was behind Joe for a lot of the time. He was a little bit slower in that Alfa Romeo, and that probably cost him a little bit. However, for Albon, I think, we haven't really seen too much of him, but overall it's fairly average, as I would say. There's nothing I've noticed to be too badly wrong, or there's nothing too great either, so I think I'm going to give him a 5. Next up then, we move to AlphaTauri, and I'm going to start with De Vries, the person who I would say has been the worst driver so far this year, and I think that's fair to say so. However, this race in Monaco was by far his best performance, in the sense of we didn't see any mistakes from him, we didn't see him in the coverage, which is probably a good thing for someone like him. So yeah, no real mistakes, he's done things fairly well, taken the medium tyres 50 odd laps all the way to the intermediate stage, same as his teammate did, same as the likes of a Verstappen did, and that's really got to go down as quite an achievement. And swapping onto the intermediate tyre straight away meant that he maintained his P12 position, which in Monaco means he's fairly close to the points. Well, in any race means he's fairly close to the points. But on the whole, I think it's a really solid race for De Vries, and I'm going to give him a 7. It may be slightly elevated because of how poorly the rest of the season gone, but he's made no mistakes, he's driven well, he's managed tyres. That's all you can really do in Monaco. Apologies, I don't normally do this, but once again I am going to lower it because it's looking further back at the timings when I've been looking at other drivers. I've just come across that De Vries was around 20 seconds behind the McLarens, so I'm going to drop him from a 7 down to a 6, which is probably more realistic. It's still a very solid result for him and a fairly solid race, but that pace definitely drops him back a little. Next up we have his teammate Yuki, who started off absolutely fine, was running in P9 inside the top 10, ahead of both McLarens, effectively in that best of the rest position if you count the Alpines as replacing Stroll and Perez in the top 8 drivers. And yeah, Yuki was looking pretty fine, he was pulling a gap to Norris behind. However, later on in the race ran into problems with his brakes, similar to what he'd had on the Saturday beforehand, where they effectively just weren't really working. We even had the engineers telling him to adjust some buttons for the brake balance and things, and he's there asking him oh, are you trying to make me crash the car because of how bad things were? So I think for him, unfortunately, towards the end of the race, things out of his control have meant that he's finished a lot further down. He's gone from 9th to 15th place, and you look at the strategy, taking the medium tyres all the way to 50 odd laps, swapping onto the intermediates, he would have been on for a couple of points, I reckon. And so for Yuki, I'm going to give him a 7. It's the same rating as De Vries because they've basically done the same thing, which is nurse the medium tyres, be fairly comfortable with the cars around you, and taken them all the way straight onto the intermediates, and obviously I'm not going to dock him anything for having bad brakes. Next we move on to Alfa Romeo, and I'm going to start with Valtteri Bottas, and someone who's finally had a fairly solid race. We actually saw him earlier on making an overtake, I think it was on Alex Albon maybe at the hairpin. I think it was on a Williams car if I remember correctly. So that's a plus for Bottas for sure, managing to overtake at Monaco. And later on, the strategy definitely played in his favour. He started on hard tyres, meaning he could change straight to the intermediates, and that's jumped him up a few places in the order, starting down in 15th and finishing up in 11th, almost picking up a point. For him, I think it's a really solid drive and a solid sort of position change, making his way forward. Admittedly, starting on the hard tyres definitely does help, but still, you've got to take advantage of that. You've got to keep it on the track in the wets, which I believe he did. And so for Valtteri, I think it's going to be a 7.5. It's a really solid race overall and worthy of a good result. Then moving on to Zhou Guanyu in the other Alfa Romeo, pitted early on the end of lap 1 coming off of his soft tyres. I believe was the only driver to start on the soft tyres actually. Maybe that was part of the plan, going from soft to then try and take the hards to the end, but it did kind of work out for him because it meant that he could take those hards really long and then swap onto the intermediates straight away in one switch, which ultimately has gained him a number of positions. He's finished 6 places higher than he started, and at a track like Monaco, regardless of strategy, regardless of your pace, that means you've done things well, either yourself or the team, and overall in Monaco that finished position is what's really important. And so for Zhou, I think he's had a really good race on the whole. I don't recall too many incidents or really seeing him having problems. I think he was overtaken at Hülkenberg at one point because I remember Hülkenberg got by Logan Sargent first before him, but still, on the whole, it's a fairly solid race, but not overly incredible, simply because when I look back at all the timings, he was generally a lot further back compared to, say, like a Valtteri Bottas, or some other cars around him sort of dropping pace-wise a little bit off of them. So for him, I think I'm going to give him a 6.5. Overall, that rating or position change of +6 is really helping him there. And so I think a 6.5, an above average race, is a fair result for him. Next up, we have the McLarens, who for most of the start of the race found themselves sandwiched in between Tsunoda and De Vries. I'll start with Piastri, who was second in the sort of McLaren train. Overall for him, starting on the hard tyres and taking them all the way to the intermediates did work well, as it meant he only had to make that one stop. However, on those intermediate tyres was where he lost out just a little bit, as he was ahead of his teammate Norris, because Norris went medium to hards and then the inters, as you'll see. So Piastri was ahead when they're both on intermediate tyres. However, did lose the place to Lando because it just took him that little bit longer getting up to speed, really getting comfortable with the tyres in those conditions, and that's where the difference between a Piastri as a rookie and Norris as a slightly more experienced driver really comes in. However, for Oscar, I still think it's a really solid result as a whole. He's not lost anything, he's not really made any mistakes. We saw a lot of drivers in the walls or hitting other cars, and he's not really done any of those. So I think for him, a 6 is probably a fair result. He has lost out just a little bit when you consider sort of the McLaren's range of where they could possibly finish. You know, he could have been up in 9th rather than 10th, but on the whole, it's still fairly solid. Next up then, Lando Norris, who, as I mentioned, went from the medium tyres, swapped to the hard tyres for just 4 laps, and then onto the intermediates. Spent most of that early stint behind Yuki Tsunoda, where he was sort of sitting round about 4 or 5 seconds behind him, so didn't quite have the pace compared to Yuki, and so I think eventually pitted onto those hard tyres to try and get the undercut. Didn't really work out in the terms of his overall race kind of timing because of the rain coming. However, managed to minimise the damage, and because they built such a big gap to De Vries behind, it meant that he was, able to recover by overtaking his teammate while on the intermediates to get back up into that 9th place where he'd been running for most of this one, or 10th place I think in fact, but still was always running in the bottom end of the points. So I think for Norris it's probably going to be a 7. It's a fairly solid race, and we've had a lot of those just fairly solid races where people have maintained their position, not done anything wrong, and I think for Lando that's definitely the case in this one. Next up, we move on to Ferrari, and I'm going to start with Charles Leclerc in this one, because what I think was really interesting here is that 3-place grid penalty he got given for impeding Lando Norris, and I really think that's cost him a shot for a podium here, not just because it's a 3rd place, but because of what I think his pace would have been had he not had Hamilton in front of him, Sainz in front of him, and Ocon, who I generally think would have all been slower cars pace-wise. But for Leclerc, that's where he was, and ultimately the only decision he sort of had to make here is when to swap onto the intermediates. He went from hards, and the team called him in, onto medium tyres after 44 laps, so he was already on the medium tyres. It wasn't like he had a choice between the two. And we saw that they definitely stayed out way too long, and I think the way I always look at it in these ones is when it's getting wetter, it needs to be on the driver to say, I need to come in, I can't drive anymore. However, when it's drying up, I would say that needs to be on the team more so to let the driver know what's coming, because ultimately if it dries up, they need to be on those dry tyres, but whatever, that's not the point here. The point is that I do think Leclerc should have made more of a call to come in, as we really saw those Ferraris struggling, and ultimately that's cost the pair of them a couple of spaces. Where he has sort of benefited though, however, I will add that he did manage to get ahead of Sainz, albeit through Sainz sliding off the track, but not making any mistakes while on the medium tyres did mean that he had priority pit stop, which I would say put him out ahead of Gasly. So for Leclerc, it's probably a disappointing result for him, but overall he personally hasn't done too badly. So I think for Leclerc, I'm going to give him a 6. On the whole, it's still okay, it's not too bad, but I just feel like that 6th place is going to be a bit disappointing. Then we move to Carlos Sainz, who I think you'd have to say had quite a frustrating race. Started on the hard tyres but was stuck behind Esteban Ocon on the mediums, was able to keep really close to him and actually had a go at overtaking out of the tunnel. But as we saw, sort of half-hearted with the move, didn't fully commit, and he ended up breaking his front wing. Was lucky that the piece fell off quickly enough so that he wasn't called in, as otherwise it would have really absolutely ruined his race, so he was a bit lucky there. From there onwards, the pace was absolutely fine. He never looked under pressure, if anyone can be under pressure too much at Monaco. But for Sainz, the pace was absolutely fine, and the team were the ones that brought him in to cover off Hamilton. You know, he wanted to go longer on those hard tyres, and we saw that actually that would have been the correct call. You know, he would have swapped straight onto the Inters, probably could have finished much higher up. But as the case is, the team brought him in to cover off Hamilton, and that kind of solidified where he was. Where it went wrong then was swapping onto the Inters, and he made a mistake sliding off the track at Mirabeau, which dropped him a number of places. You know, he was in between Ocon and Hamilton, would have been in 4th place, and sliding off the track has cost him. It's dumped him all the way down into 8th. And honestly, that's the big mistake that he's made. He's lucky to have still been able to carry on and finish the race. And ultimately, yes, there were a number of drivers who made mistakes, but if you're one that's made one, it is going to cost you. So I think for Sainz, it's probably going to be a 3.5, simply because he's hit Ocon, made a mistake there, and then he's made an even bigger mistake in the rain on the Inters, sliding into the barrier, and is lucky to have finished 8th, considering he could have been out of it all. Obviously, the strategy, that's not his call, that's on the team, but still, where he's finished from starting up in effectively, 4th place with Ocon, not Ocon, Leclerc's penalty, to finish in 8th, definitely disappointing. Next up, we move on to Aston Martin, who are coming in as the 4th highest scoring team in this one, even though Alonso finished 2nd. And I'm going to start with Fernando because his race was generally very good, and a lot of that goes down to the pace that we saw. Him and Verstappen were easily able to pull away, and while Alonso wasn't able to stay right with Verstappen, he was able to stay within touching distance had something like the conditions changed, and he could have taken advantage of it. And that did happen for him. He had that opportunity, but him and the team just didn't take advantage of it. I think if you're Fernando, you've got to look at it and say, you know, put your foot down and say, it's intermediate tyres, I need the wet weather tyres, we're going to put them on. Because ultimately he came in and spent a single lap on the mediums. And either the team, you know, keep him out a lap longer, don't necessarily make the call onto the mediums now. If it's going to dry up, you're still going to have to make your stop, so is everyone else. And so maybe that's on the team, maybe that's on him, but I think ultimately between the pair of them, you've got to try and make a better decision there. Obviously, much easier said than done, but they have made the wrong call. And although Verstappen finished further up the road, I think it was 20 odd seconds, it did get rid of any chance he would have had of the win. You know, he possibly could have been in with a chance if he'd managed to get that right, or it would have at least been close. However, as we saw, it ultimately didn't cost him too much in terms of a position. So rating wise for Alonso, I think it's going to go down as a 7.5. It's a really solid drive and the pace was really good, but ultimately hasn't quite been able to take advantage. And so that's going to cost him just a little bit compared to maybe an 8.5 or an 8. And then we move on to his Aston Martin teammate Lance Stroll, who's had an absolute disaster. Qualified terribly, was right down in sort of 15th place, I believe it was, no, 14th. From there, he's collided on lap 1, tried to squeeze through a gap that just isn't there with Albon. So he's got damage and a puncture, he's got to come into the pits, that relegates him to the back. And then later on in the race, we saw he hit the wall once, broke the front wing, hit the twice, broke the front wing. We saw him go off to the runoff area, or we didn't actually see it, but we saw him there when I think it was Russell went off. And he was sat there, I remember Crofty getting all excited, thinking it was Alonso possibly. Oh my gosh, what a shock. But no, it was Stroll. He's made a number of mistakes in there. The pace, obviously at the back, you're kind of stuck. You're in an Aston Martin and your teammate's finishing in 2nd place. It's honestly a disastrous weekend for Stroll. I honestly think this has to go down as like a 1.5 kind of rating, simply because he's made so many mistakes, both in the dry, he's made mistakes in the wet, he's not finished the race, and you look at where Alonso is, and even just looking at the standings as well, it's just not good enough from him. Next, we move over to the Alpine drivers, and I'm going to start with Pierre, because if you can have a quiet race between the two, it was a little bit more mundane for him. Generally, went along well in the first stint, running along in 7th place, wasn't under too much pressure, but wasn't putting any pressure on cars ahead of him. I believe with regards to the strategy was trying to overcut some of the cars around him. You look at Leclerc came in early, but then possibly tried to undercut Russell because he stopped before him. Ultimately, it's not really affected his race too much, the strategy, with where he's kind of ended up, still in that P7, started 7th, finished 7th. And so for Pierre, I think it's just a really solid race. I don't recall him going off or having any incidents. Keeping it clean, keeping it fairly steady is a good result for him, and at a track where ultimately it's hard to move up the field, especially in that top 10, to maintain your position in what was kind of a chaotic race is generally a good performance. So I think for Gasly, it probably goes down as a 6.5, maybe a 7. I think it's going to be a 6.5 simply just because of where his teammates finish. He is a bit further back in this one, but on the whole, it's still a very solid above average drive. And then we move on to Esteban Ocon, who personally is my driver of the day. He was fantastic. Managed to keep the likes of Carlos Sainz behind him, Lewis Hamilton behind him. Yes, it's Monaco, but I don't necessarily mean physically behind, but not even letting them put too much pressure on him. Didn't make a mistake, kept it going in the right direction, kept the pace up as well. Obviously, he fell back from Alonso and Verstappen up ahead, but he's in an Alpine, that's going to happen. Ultimately, the hard work for him was done on the Saturday, and he's done everything he needed to do on the Sunday. There were so many things that could have caught him out. He could have had poor pace around the pit stop phases, could have made mistakes while they were on slicks in the wet, could have made mistakes while he was on the wet tyres, and could have made mistakes with pressure from behind, but he has held on incredibly well. And to come away with a podium, a P3, when realistically, we say this every week on the pre-race podcast, if you ever watch that with myself and Not Applicable F1, what we end up seeing is that those top 8 spots should normally be filled by drivers. So to come away with one of those spots and it be a podium as well in Monaco, it's a fantastic drive and has to go down as probably like a 9.5 for me. I honestly can't think of many mistakes. I'm always just a little hesitant to give a 10 just because I am, but a 9.5 is basically as high as I can go for Ocon. Next up, Mercedes, and starting with George Russell, who's pulled a pretty classic George Russell strategy. We saw it a lot last year where he started on the hard tyres, went as long as he could and hoped for a safety car, or in this case, the safety car which came in the form of rain, meaning everyone had to change tyres. And for Russell, it did originally work out. He was up to 4th place. He started down in 8th, would have been up 4 places, but did make a big mistake sliding off into the barriers, which allowed a number of people through. Well, not a number of people, I think it was actually just Hamilton. But it allowed some of the lap cars to come through, and we saw that when he rejoined, hit Perez, could have easily been out of the race in that one. It was a pretty nasty collision, actually, sort of being lifted in the air, hit at the side. Lucky to carry on, did get a 5-second penalty, but ultimately had the pace to stay ahead of Leclerc, so it didn't affect his final position. So for Russell, I think pace-wise, he was absolutely fine. We saw when he was behind Hamilton, was generally there and thereabouts. Admittedly, it's intermediates, it's strange conditions. Hamilton did pull away towards the end, but on the whole, I think the pace was fine. I think the only thing that docks him a little bit is that sort of collision / sliding off. And it's a bit of a double whammy. You've slid off in the first place and then you've rejoined badly, got the penalty, which could have cost him 2, maybe 3 positions if things were a lot tighter. But as it were, they won't. So for Russell, I think it goes down as a 6.5. It would have been up in that sort of 7.5-ish range had he not made those mistakes. But he did. However, he has sort of got away with it in terms of his final position. Next up then, we have Lewis Hamilton, and in all honesty, I think my biggest critique here was that he wasn't more aggressive with Carlos Sainz on the first corner of the first lap. He almost got alongside and just didn't sort of push his nose in there and really get late on the brakes, was a little bit tentative, and it just meant that he was then obviously stuck behind Sainz. However, later on, obviously Sainz made the mistake, and so Hamilton, got that position anyway. But for his race, it was generally a case of sort of sitting in that ground between Sainz and ahead of Leclerc. Not really putting too much pressure on Sainz, but not feeling too much pressure from Leclerc behind. Managed to take the tyres fairly well. Lap stopped on lap 32, was sort of starting to feel the wear, trying to pull the undercut, but going onto hard tyres at a place like Monaco, it is tricky to do because they do take a little while to warm up. So from Lewis's side, I think he's done nothing wrong. I don't recall any mistakes. Didn't slide off or didn't hit any barriers. Even the likes of, I said it a couple of times in this one, Verstappen was off, Sainz and Russell were all off. Perez had shockers, Stroll in the other Aston Martin, people who you'd expect to be higher up were having shockers. So I think for Lewis, it is a really solid drive, and I think he's going to get a 7.5. Overall, it's just been solid, he's not made mistakes, and he's just picked up the maximum points that have sort of been available to him without having to do anything too special. And then finally moving on to Red Bull, and I'm going to start with Checo. A weekend to forget for him. Absolutely dreadful, makes the biggest mistake you can make in qualifying. Obviously these ratings don't include qualifying, but given it's Monaco, it very much affects your race and where you start. And for Perez, I think their strategy was to start on the medium tyres and instantly swap onto the hards and take them as long as he could, which probably would have worked had he not made a ton of contact along the way. He was, optimistic trying to get around the outside of Stroll, was lucky not to have damage there, then ran into the back of, I think it was Hülkenberg, and broke his front wing. Might have been Magnussen, it was one of the two, one of the Haas cars for sure. And yes, it did look like the Haas car slowed up a bit more than he expected, but you've still fundamentally run into the back of them. And ultimately from that point, he just became a guinea pig for Max Verstappen, which to be fair is probably what should have happened. Testing out the intermediates, the wet tyres, seeing if they wanted to swap Max onto them. So for Checo, all of his mistakes really have been of his own doing. The only sort of incident I can think of that wasn't overly his fault was the collision with George Russell. I don't think it's quite as bad as the weekend or the race that Stroll had specifically, but I still think it's down in that 2.5 range. It's really pretty dreadful, and when you consider that your teammate won the race and you're there trundling around with Alfa Romeos and Haas cars, not the best day. And then finally, we get onto Max, who in typical Verstappen fashion has absolutely nailed it. He's shown great pace on the medium tyres. He's really made them last 55 laps, which was longer than anyone. Possibly did stay out a little bit long on those medium tyres, and I think that does come down to him. It had to really start raining before he came in. And, we even saw, I can't remember if it was on inters or the mediums, but he did clip the barrier, so a little bit fortunate to not have a bigger incident there, or potentially get stuck in that sort of corner at Portier and have to reverse out. But as for what he did, it was flawless, from qualifying on Saturday to pulling away from Alonso, pulling away on the medium tyres, pulling away on the intermediate tyres as well. He's really not done too much wrong besides hitting the barrier, besides staying out a bit long. I think for Max, it's probably going to be an 8. The reason it's not like a 9 or anything like that is you have those races where they do feel a lot better, and this one just doesn't quite feel like that for me. I can't quite put my finger on it. Whether it was because he didn't pull away massively from Alonso. Remember, yes, he's finished 20 odd seconds, but Alonso's made a whole other pit stop worth 20 seconds or so. And I think that's why it's only an 8 when you factor in he did have that little mistake as well. So there you have the race ratings for the 2023 Monaco Grand Prix, with Esteban Ocon sitting at the top, a very well-deserved 9.5. That race is going to be one that he's going to remember for a time. It's got to be up there with his win back in Hungary in 2021. Down the other end, though, a couple of absolute shockers for Lance Stroll and Sergio Perez, and we're starting to see that in the championship as well. Stroll is a fair way off the back of that group with top 8, where they're sort of 7, and then him further back. You look at where Alonso is, above the Ferraris and the Mercedes cars, and then Stroll's at the bottom of all that. Perez is now sitting much closer to Alonso than he was to Verstappen. This was not the weekend that he needed, so definitely work to do if he wants to still even have a shot potentially for a title. I know it's very far-fetched, to be honest. Also, this is the first time taking a look at the averages, and you can see obviously the likes of Alonso and Max Verstappen right at the top there. Those two have really been performing well this season. Other people like Gasly have been doing well, and also Lewis Hamilton, as you would expect, he's up there too. Down the other end of the field, the rookies struggling a little bit. The Alfa Romeo cars had a bit of a better weekend, sort of elevating them from the rookies. But in general, it has been De Vries and Sargent who haven't had the best of weekends as a whole as you look at the season. But anyway, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have, do give the video a thumbs up and you get yourself subscribed for more F1 content this year. But until next time, take care.